Hello and welcome. This is Comics Corner, episode 78. I'm your host, Jason, the curator of comics. And today I'm going to talk about two things in particular. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about something that I've been reading relatively recently. I just got done reading the DC Comics, reprint, or not reprint, reboot rather, of Wildstorm, called The Wildstorm. It's kind of a reboot of a lot of Jim Lee's products from the 90s, which were created into a compilation, an offshoot publication called The Wildstorm that DC eventually bought. They bought Wildstorm and they bought all the characters, and they've used them sparingly since the DC Rebirth recently. They did use them a little bit in the New 52. They used some Gen 13 characters mostly, but a lot of other Jim Lee creations from that era, which were also kind of sort of tied into Image Comics. Because here's the funny thing. Jim Lee was one of the top original producers down at Image Comics. He was one of the guys who joined up with them, not at the outset, but he joined relatively shortly after Image Comics was created. And he made a couple of books, the most noteworthy of which was WildC.A.T.s, aka Wild Covert Operation, or no wait, no, I'm sorry, the acronym's wrong here. Whoopsie. Covert WildC.A.T.s, which stood for Wild Covert, or the cat part of it stood for Covert Action Team, and basically it is kind of what you expected. Now, I'm not going to compare the Wildstorm to WildC.A.T.s, even though, ironically enough, if I had to pick a Wildstorm universe story that the Wildstorm basically takes most of its identity from, it is WildC.A.T.s. And I'm sure that was intentional, but it actually is more or less its own reboot, its own thing. I liked WildC.A.T.s for what it was. Don't get me wrong. It's very 90s. It's very dated. A lot of Image Comics from back in the early 90s, with like the exception of like Spawn and Savage Dragon, those comics that got constant, consistent care from their creators, both Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson respectively. They're really the only Image Comics that you can go back and you can kind of see where the whole thing developed, and they're really the only two major early Image characters that are still around, ironically enough. There's a reason why I say that Spawn probably single-handedly saved Image Comics, and it's probably because Todd McFarlane became so dedicated to the character that it became his Spider-Man, his character, his linchpin, if you will, to his legacy. And it also helps that he also runs a production company that makes really great toys. Cheap pop, or plug rather, for that. WildC.A.T.s, it is what it is. It's a very generic, kind of interesting at times. There's some sci-fi elements that, you'll like, but it's typical 90s stuff. It's dark, it's gritty, the art's over the top, and it really hasn't aged well. Like, there's over-muscled dudes, awkward poses for women, and some skimpy attire. People are missing eyes, or irises of their eyes rather, as was the standard for like Image in particular for some reason. It's just, it's not terrible, but you could do a lot better for 1990s comics than WildC.A.T.s. You could do a far lot worse, even within Image's own library, but you could do far better. I have the first couple issues. Surprisingly, only half the characters from WildC.A.T.s actually really make an appearance. And with this whole reboot with the Wildstorm thing, they didn't really address a whole lot of how this fits into the continuity. Like, if it's a hard reboot where Wildstorm the Wildstorm is like replacing the old universe, and they're going to introduce it gradually in, like Gen 13 and Stormwatch, although there is a Stormwatch in this. The only difference is that in the Wildstorm, Stormwatch is apparently some sort of global corporation that is convinced that space is the way of the future, and they live exclusively in space, and they control space. And then there's another shady government organization in the Wildstorm that runs basically all of Earth. So yeah, in fact, I'll basically just sum up the plot of the Wildstorm. Basically, it's two shadow governments going to war. One with supreme space tech, the other is, an Earth-based, weapons tech, shady government type organization. And basically, they're kind of at a secret truce with each other, but they're obviously trying to outdo one another at the same time. And basically, what ends up happening is a character from the original Wildcats called the Engineer. In this case, her name is Angela Specca. She basically does some experimentation with stolen Stormwatch technology. Or is it Stormwatch? I think it's Stormwatch. It might have, yeah, it's Stormwatch. Even though technically it's Skywatch, I think that it's Skywatch in the comic, but I think essentially it's supposed to be Stormwatch from the old days. Like it's supposed to be a replacement for that. Anyways, but yeah, basically she uploads a whole bunch of stolen tech into her body and gives herself the ability to kind of transform into, or give herself an android super suit with biotic power, or not biotic, bionic powers, and lasers, like a robot. And basically she does this without her employer, the international operation, or is it the international or the internal? I believe it's the internal operation. Yeah, no, it's the international operations. I am not having it. I do not have it all today, apparently. The international operations, which basically, yeah, really creative name on that. And they're basically the shadow government for the Earth. They develop tech, they do espionage and all this thing. They're not really well fleshed out. They're like this apparently giant, secret conglomerate that has all this power, but they don't really, like to be seen kind of thing. It actually kind of brings to mind that there's a third power in this. So you got the people that want the sky, you got the people that want, the Earth, and then you've got the people that we're actually supposed to be rooting for in the form of Halo. No, not the Bungie game. Halo Technologies, run by Jacob Marlowe. Now, this is actually a recycle from the original WildC.A.T.s. Jacob Marlowe was this dude who basically kind of stumbled into technology, and he's supposed to be this kind of real diminutive guy, but he's got these kind of mutant powers, and he basically used his fortune in tech to kind of basically create a refuge and his own strike team to kind of the Wildcat, aka covert action team, to kind of strike back against the government that they were fighting against at the time. Now, my memory's a little hazy about this. I haven't read Wildcats in a while. I still have the issues, but the point is that Jacob Marlowe was this kind of guy who, he was a grizzled older guy who, he kind of looked like Cable. That's the best way to describe him. Like, for some reason, if you had a grizzled, old guy, he had to look a little bit like Cable back then, because Rob Liefeld, right, in Image, anyways, I digress. But yeah, I mean, he was an interesting character. He didn't really do a whole lot initially in the Wildcats run of like the issues I have. Although what I did read later on is that what he ended up doing was he actually ended up creating an android called Spartan that essentially is immortal. And this android actually eventually ends up taking Jacob Marlowe's place, because Marlowe ends up dying or sacrificing himself for some greater good in their fight or something. And Spartan basically decides to, try and, bring the company public and, improve the world as Jacob Marlowe. And he, kind of rebrands himself, Jack Marlowe, so that, he's not completely stealing, the identity, but it's Spartan who's, basically, this guy, Jacob Marlowe now. Unfortunately, like I said, because this is kind of a reboot, that much is certain. Like, it's unclear of how much of a reboot it is, because the only volume that I have is Wildstorm, the first one, and of the Wildstorm is the first one, and I only think they've probably produced only the second volume of the trade, so it means they're probably only, a little bit into the story. But regardless, I'm sure that will get explained later on in terms of the reboot. and the continuity and everything. But I have to admit that I really, really do like the story they're trying to tell. It's written by Warren Ellis, and Warren Ellis is just amazing. Like, he is really an underrated sci-fi writer who does not get enough credit for what he does in comics. He's done a lot of work for I believe Aliens versus Predator. I could be misremembering. I know he had a bit of a hand in a couple of other major sci-fi titles too back in the day. He really is a guy who just does not get enough credit for what he does, and the art is actually really good. It's a great, in my opinion, it's actually probably the perfect way to update the Image style. And in many ways, it's a great update to the characters themselves, because a lot of the original Wildcats characters are in the Wildstorm as their various personas. You've got Voodoo, who is, this kind of pop star celebrity who finds out she's got mutant powers. You've got Zealot, who's this assassin, stone cold lady who just, is apparently in this world, she's a little more friendly, but she's still, an assassin by trade. So there's that. And then you've got Cole Cash, aka Grifter, who's just like he's the one character that they didn't bother to change like at all. He's just like so 90s, it's not even funny. With like the most pathetic attempt at a mask like I've ever seen. He literally looks like he he stretched out Deadpool's mask and cut out like the back for the head, so that his hair would show, or the top rather, because that's his mask. He does. It's not very good. It's pretty pathetic actually. And then you've got Adriana. I'm not even gonna bother trying to pronounce her last name. It's a Russian last name. Who was Void in the original series, and she kind of looked like this Silver Surfer-esque character. Here, she actually she maintains that look, but she also wears. But her story is probably the most interesting of them all, because in both versions, she's like this Russian cosmonaut who basically comes into contact with this, extra dimensional force while doing a mission. And basically, it's called the Bleed, and basically it gives her the ability to warp time and space. She's actually essentially dead, too. That's the other thing that's interesting about her. But yet she, through the Bleed, is still technically kind of alive. And because her physical form as the humanity knows it is not really technically there, she basically dresses up as she did as a cosmonaut, as you can see her in one of the later issues actually removing her face to kind of show that she is in fact just this kind of the shape-shifting, time warping being. Now she can't go back in time or anything, but she can teleport and travel between spaces and things of that nature. And it's actually really kind of cool, all things considered, because it's one of those things where you honestly usually either get teleportation or time-space manipulation, but this is kind of one of those weird in-betweeny things where you could argue that maybe she has the ability to manipulate time if she focused hard enough, whereas she's another case of because she's technically dead, she technically can't really die, although she can be hurt. It's one of those unique situations where you kind of wonder about the character, and I always appreciate that with these types of mutant characters, because when you got this kind of rogues gallery of characters, especially these ones with mutant powers, especially ones that are very sci-fi in nature, it's very easy to kind of write them off into archetypes. And Warren Ellis, much like Jim Lee did back in the day, does not thankfully do that. I will say that unfortunately, a lot of the character development it comes and goes a little too much for my liking. A lot of it's focused initially on Angela Specca, and the problem is that Angela Specca is not really given much of a backstory, other than she's apparently somebody who was supposed to be a low-grade engineer who somehow stole the technology from I.O., the company that runs the Earth, Shadowwise. And at the same time, I.O. apparently hates Jacob Marlowe for some reason that we're not really made privy to right away, other than maybe he's sheltering the WildC.A.T., the Wild Covert Action Team. That might be the reason. It's, again, not really made clear, because what basically ends up transpiring. It's interesting. It's an interesting set piece. Don't get me wrong, but it's essentially Jacob Marlowe's in his office and he gets thrown out a window, and you could argue that the idea was for the assassin, because spoilers, he was trying, there was an assassin trying to kill him, was that, oh, Jacob Marlowe, the eccentric billionaire, tries to jump out of his window to end it all, when Angela Specca comes in and saves the day, and basically they just see her transform. Like, she has literally no time to go covert at all. She just transforms in the middle of public. And as such, she exposes herself relatively easily. And that's kind of where the rest of the meat of the story is. It's Marlowe and his group of his Wildcat trying to get to Angela Specca before international operations does, while also at the same time you have a bit of a struggle within IO that sees one of the mercenaries, I believe I think it's Deathblow. Yeah, Deathblow. Yeah, I know, seriously. If I'm remembering correctly, he is working for them at the time, and he's kind of got this like uncurable cancer condition, aka again, basically another Deadpool reference, because back then Deadpool was just as popular as he was now, except because Rob Liefeld wrote and drew and created a lot of the early stories, he kind of took the ball and ran with it in his other creations, because I guess Rob just couldn't get enough. But I digress. And at the end of the day, it just so happens that this guy, he ends up getting betrayed, and Skywatch ends up recruiting him, because Skywatch they're kind of awkward. There's like this really old guy who's like Lex Luthor if he was aged like 102 or something, who's like clearly off his rocker, but then you can kind of tell that Skywatch itself as an organization doesn't really care about what's going on with Earth, just that they remain in control and that IO doesn't encroach upon space or steal their technology, which they did, which is what gets Skywatch even involved. And that's kind of where his whole thing. The guy's name is Michael Cray, by the way, who attempts to assassinate Jacob Marlowe and is almost assassinated himself by IO. And actually a really cool scene, by the way. Michael Cray proves that even as a sick, dying man, he can take down two assailants, and he knows what the heck he's doing. But in the end of the day, a lot of this then all kind of centers around, eventually Jacob Marlowe and the Wildcat convince Angela that there's really no reason not to join up with them, because at this point there really isn't anywhere for her to go, and that's kind of where the whole thing is left. Unfortunately, we don't really know why the villains wanted to assassinate Jacob Marlowe at all. Like, it's just kind of left in the dark. But it is early in the series. It's just the first volume of the trade that I've read recently, and yeah, it's really good. Like I said, the art style I feel is a great update of the original 90s stuff. I feel like it's much more clean and easy to take serious, but at the same time it retains a lot of that art style that made the Wildstorm brand, rather, not the Wildstorm the comic. You see how confusing this can get? So entertaining and so unique and so fresh back in the day, to the point where it kind of actually stuck out even within the DC universe, and Wildstorm itself was an imprint for DC, you know what I mean? Yeah, a lot of layers to this story. I guess the bottom line with this is I recommend this wholeheartedly if you were a fan of the original Wildcats, and if you were a fan of any of Jim Lee's original Wildstorm stuff, or even just passingly knew of Wildstorm as an imprint, or even some of the early Image stuff, because like I said, there's a lot of references to early Image stuff, aplenty in this, because of Jim Lee taking the title Wildcats and some of his other ones with him, like Gen 13, for example. There's a lot of stuff like that I feel is in there. It's not very humorous. There's not a whole lot of humor to be found. And I feel that that's kind of where, maybe it misses the mark a little bit, because I could almost feel like, this is one of those moments where you could, have somebody be, kind of maybe not comic relief, but at least, poke fun at the idea of the sci-fi nature of the plot. Granted, that is kind of Grifter's idea, but I really don't care about Grifter at all. Grifter was, he's kind of like the boring, generic action hero type guy who you don't really care who he is. You just care what he's doing, because what he's doing looks cool, but he himself is very just monotone, very gray, very boring, about as interesting as a TV dinner that's unheated, if you will. I don't know where I pulled that one out from. But yeah, I mean, I still recommend it. I think, like I said, Warren Ellis does a great job writing it. And the only other thing that I will say about this that actually did kind of get on my nerves a little bit was there wasn't any sneaking in of politics, thankfully, because this was a 2017 comic. It started in 2017, and Lord knows it could have had political implementations. But I will say that one thing that I did find a little awkward and off-putting, or at the very least a little difficult to follow initially, was the head guy down at IO, the International Operations, Shadow Government. He apparently, he's in a board meeting at one moment with these two women, and acknowledging how they're going to take over the world, and the world will finally be theirs. But then he's seen moments later in a scene with a guy who, because he apparently is gay and a gay lover. So, I mean, it's weird because the guy makes insinuations. I mean, not sexual advances, but, kind of insinuations towards the females, about how it's theirs for the taking the world, or stuff of that nature. I don't know. It's one of the more confusing things because, again, like I said, the whole idea of these two organizations are never really explained except for what they control. Like, we don't get any insight into who these characters that run these shadow organizations are and why they care. We just know that they want power, and power for the sake of power seems to be the idea of the day when it comes to this whole thing. I mean, it's not that that's wrong. I mean, hey, a lot of villains start out in comics as very one-dimensional. I'm evil for evil's sake, or I'm evil because I'm crazy and I can't be stopped kind of thing by normal means. But when you're dealing with regular humans, you want a little more depth, especially when they're not super powered. You kind of want a little more depth. Yes, they're sci-fi tech type villains who have great tech under their control, etc., but you still want more to them, and it's not really presented at least as well as it could have been. And that's just my opinion, honestly, because really that's all I can say that I didn't like about it was that the villains aren't fleshed out. And like I said, Angela Specca herself, supposedly the main character of this, isn't very well fleshed out. Now, I suppose if I actually read into Wildcats into the point where I actually remember reading about the engineer, I'd actually might care a little bit more about her character, but I actually can't remember the engineer even making an appearance in Wildcats when I read her, or when I read the book, pardon. Maybe I didn't get far enough into the series because, it initially started as a mini-series, as a lot of Image Comics did at the time. They were mini-series first, and then they got made into bigger publications as time went on. But even then, I still, don't know who she is, and not that I don't care, I'm just saying, hey, I don't know who she is, and that's kind of a bit of a problem when she's supposed to be one of the main characters. Also, probably for the best that they cut out the Wolverine ripoff, because, yes, there was, in fact, a Wolverine ripoff in Wildcats, rather. Again, you can see how confusing this whole idea gets when you pull, essentially, the blueprint for the Wildstorm with characters from Wildcats, and you essentially create this giant continuity mess for anybody who's actually read even the first few issues of Wildcats, because a lot of this stuff is very similar. It's just that it's done with a lot more class, a lot better art, and just generally speaking is a lot more entertaining to read nowadays. Sorry, 1990s comics fan, but it is. It's much more coherent to read, at least. And the art doesn't hurt my eyes while looking at it, which is a plus. I mean, I kid. I mean, 90s artwork had its charm for what it was, but you got to admit, the 90s art style was not easy on the eyes after a while. It's just like, oh my gosh, what am I looking at? And that's, and that's with me saying that some of the, the more innovative comic creations and some of my favorite comic characters or the ideas, for certain things like that came from the 90s. That's not me ripping on the 90s in the comic industry as a whole. It's just that, there were some things that didn't necessarily age as well as they could have. But that's, the story with a lot of media. I mean, in many ways, I kind of treat a lot of the 1990s art the way I treat like 1950s comic writing, in the sense that it's so tacky, so cheesy, so over the top that you can't believe you're reading it. But if you love the medium, you tolerate it anyways, because it's just one of the growing pains that the industry had to go through in order to reach its current state. And that is a good thing, because believe it or not, we are at a really good state of things for the most part. But yeah, that's my opinions on the Wildstorm. I really liked it, and I really look forward to reading more of it. Hope there's more. But yeah, no Warblade, which was the Wolverine ripoff. He also had a very stupid ponytail, and geez, I could probably talk, for an hour about the serious like weirdness that was Wildcats when it came to like the character design and just what were they thinking in terms of those kinds of things, because it just wasn't necessarily up to par with what you would hope, especially with Jim Lee trying to write, like he hadn't been given a whole lot of opportunities to write at this point, to my knowledge, when he started at Image. So, you would expect something like this from him, hey, I'm not good at creating characters yet, so I'm going to kind of copy a couple of well-known ones, but give them brand new names kind of thing. But, even then, it's still kind of blatant how many of them could be honestly traced to being very similar to other Image characters, if not other comic characters. And that's the other thing. It's like, it wasn't even that they were ripoffs of regular, mainstream comic heroes, that they were ripoffs of a lot of Image characters that were already existent in design and things of that nature. But that's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. The other thing that I wanted to talk about very briefly before I talked about the other major news story that came out that kind of got me in a bit of a riled up state was the idea that that I watched the newest DC animated movie, Gotham by Gaslight. I really liked it. I will say that if you are expecting, Kevin Conroy as Batman, you're not going to get it, but Bruce Greenwood does a great job as Batman. And it's based on the Gotham by Gaslight comic graphic novel, collection. So, and basically what it amounts to is Batman versus Jack the Ripper. And I'm not going to spoil it beyond that, but, you get a lot of the DC, or a lot of Batman universe characters involved. You get Commissioner Gordon, Barbara Gordon, you get you get Catwoman, you get Poison Ivy in there for a little bit, you get Doctor Strange, or not Doctor Strange as in Marvel, but Dr. Hugo Strange, rather, the Batman villain. Again, comics are confusing. And a couple of other mainstream, DC counterparts, including some nods to Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, and I want to say that the last one is either Tim Drake. Like all three of the young, boy Robins, boy Wonders, as like street urchins in this, because it is kind of set in that kind of like that 1880s, that very steampunky Sherlock Holmes style of era that, was kind of on the cusp of, that kind of weird in-between period where we're kind of on the cusp of modern technology, yet we're still living in a bit of a darker age at the same time. Like not everybody has access to, electricity and in the way that we see it today, or everything's still communicated by the paper, and there's no automobiles, things of that nature. But we still have, like things like heating furnaces and things of that nature that are, kind of seen as modern, just basic staples today. Those are the types of things that were coming out during that time, and this just turned into a random historical rant. But My point is, Gotham by Gaslight. I haven't read the graphic novel. I don't know how it differs from the film. I would doubt very, very much, but it is very good. I liked it a lot. Gotham by Gaslight is a very good film with a plot twist that I didn't see coming. You'll probably guess the Ripper's identity, and you might actually guess it correctly, but if you're like me, you'll probably guess the Ripper's identity halfway through the movie, and you'll actually be wrong. And then when you do actually get the Ripper's reveal and just how the character is portrayed, like the Ripper's reason for doing this all, it's not only a complete 180 as to what the real motives of the real Jack the Ripper could have arguably been, like what psychologists believe and what, regular people would see as the motivations for it versus the actual motivations for it is, or in Gotham by Gaslight, that Jack the Ripper in this movie, his motivations, they are something else. And it really just kind of paints how, it doesn't matter if Batman may seem like the dark, mysterious figure that you can't trust. In the end, he's still probably the best person in Gotham because he's the only one who stands up to fight these kinds of people. Whether he succeeds or not is entirely up to you. And also, Catwoman plays a great role in this too. I like what they did with the character of Catwoman. Selena Kyle. I honestly am going to go on record and say that also Selena Kyle is probably Batman's, at least for me, probably my ideal match for her. Just because I think Selena Kyle kind of fills all of Batman's, fills in a lot of Batman's deficiencies as a person, much in the same way I believe Batman does the same for Selena. Like they kind of play off each other in probably the best possible way. They say opposites attract, and while they are very opposite, it's those things that make them opposites that allow them to work well together and come together as a couple so many times in the comics. And while I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that, as a canon relationship for Batman, like, Selena Kyle should ever be the only one because I think it kind of betrays the identity of Bruce Wayne as a character. I will say that in terms of if you had to rank who's the most logical in terms of a love interest that Bruce Wayne could probably last with, I'd say Selena Kyle's probably at the top of the list. And that's really the point I'm trying to make. And again, this movie kind of proves it with the writing and everything. And that's really all there is to say. And the writing's really good. The art style is really good. It's nothing different from what you've seen in other DC animated features. It's a little less cartoony than, say, Batman and Harley Quinn, which came out, 6 months before. It's more along the lines of the Batman cartoon, like the 1990s Batman cartoon. Except, there's no Joker or anything like that has an exaggerated face or something to kind of, more realistic, but still kind of in that same vein, if you will. And by the way, also you'll be pleasantly surprised, the Joker is not Jack the Ripper. Although, if I'm being honest, that was probably my first initial guess when I was reading the box. I was like, oh great, this is going to be the first incarnation of the Joker, isn't it? Or something like a steampunk Joker. But no, it is not. In fact, it is, like I said, something you will never expect nor see coming, and it's better for that. And now I'm going to talk. I've been trying to pinpoint news stories in the comic industry that I actually care enough about to talk about. That's why I haven't done a CCN news in a while. But I found one. And this is probably going to be, one where it's like, it's a little old news, but it's also kind of a fresh wound for a lot of people, myself included. So, you know how Donald Glover and FX, were going to actually make a Deadpool cartoon? Him, Donald Glover, and his brother Steven were gonna make a cartoon about Deadpool. It even had 10 episodes lined up, and it was kind of ready to go and everything. Well, yeah, that's been canceled. That's not really the news because that was kind of basically known. And throughout the past week or so, since the cancellation, or it's actually been more like 2 weeks now, it's been kind of slowly but surely trickled out, by both Steven and Donald Glover, just as to why FX shut down the Deadpool cartoon. And believe it or not, the culprit is not what you would expected, which, if upon reading that, I actually thought that it was like some sort of political correctness group, like 1 Million Moms, or there was an episode where Deadpool shot a puppy by accident and, got PETA all upset. No, it was someone else apparently that has a lot of clout in the entertainment industry, and somebody who honestly probably shouldn't really care about this anyways, but she is probably the most vain, thin-skinned celebrity this side of a Kardashian, so, what are you going to do? Um, I'm talking about Taylor Swift. Believe it or not, yes, that Taylor Swift. She apparently, according to, and this is from Stephen Glover, apparently they had a Taylor Swift episode for the Deadpool cartoon, kind of poking fun and lampooning her, which I'm all for because I'm not a Taylor Swift fan. I can't stand her music. I think that she's very, like I said, vain, a very shallow celebrity who can't take criticism of her personal life, which, hey, I can understand that being, a tough pill to swallow. But she also apparently can't seem to take criticism from her peers or, actual music, in regards to her music at all, because, that's just, that's preposterous that Taylor Swift would have to, you know, think that, anybody would say no to her kind of thing. But I digress. And I should admit that it's not an episode per se, but it was a joke about Taylor Swift. And apparently, according to FX, or rather Stephen Glover, he said that it was apparently the last straw, which I don't really, really know how it was the last straw. It must have been something really, really damning to Taylor Swift. Must have been like a real, like, a relationship below the belt punchline, or like one of those Kanye Kim references, which I probably would have, laughed at first, and then probably just would have been like, ugh, later on, because, it's just like, I don't care about, those particular, celebrities that I just named. So therefore, I don't really care what's going on. I find those particular individuals that I just mentioned insufferable. So therefore, I don't care. And anytime there's humor made at their expense, I laugh, but I also kind of groan because it's like we're just giving them more attention. But anyways, Glover went on to basically say, though, that he was proud of basically what they were creating, and that he said that he wanted to give Rick and Morty a run for their money. And you know what? I'm going to be perfectly honest. I know that Rick and Morty being on Adult Swim means that they've got the demographic that they're looking for already nailed down. That kind of late night TV junkies who enjoy these kind of adult cartoons when they're not on Sundays on like Fox. And Fox, admittedly, has the market kind of cornered on all the other adult cartoons between, Family Guy and The Simpsons and American Dad. I mean, say what you will about their quality, but they do have the market cornered on them. And FX, I can't remember. I think FX is actually a subdivision of Fox. If I'm remembering correctly. I honestly don't watch anything that's on FX, so yeah. Now, it's worth pointing out that Marvel does have a partnership with FX, so they would actually have, so I can imagine that both sides had a bit of joint mutual power, and apparently Marvel is still going to continue doing Legion, which, yay, X-Men spinoff. Woo. I mean, I think it's actually in the same vein as The Gifted. And I think maybe not so much. I could be wrong. Again, admittedly, I haven't watched them, so yeah. Um. Anyways, Glover does assure that at least one thing that it was not about a racism thing, which is good because I can only imagine, because apparently, according to Stephen Glover, he said that he was not too busy to work on on Deadpool, which is not necessarily that's a good thing. Or actually, no, Donald Glover said this. My bad. And he said that all the writers were actually black, so and the references were black, aka this would be kind of a black comedy. And you know what? If I'm being perfectly honest, when Deadpool isn't breaking the fourth wall, I can kind of picture the writers kind of leaning on that kind of black comedy, for lack of a better term, because that is a lot of Deadpool humor when it's not, breaking the fourth wall or mocking other heroes, kind of taking the piss out of, comic books in general. The idea is that Deadpool, is very quippy. He'll sometimes, say and do things that no other hero would dare, and that's kind of why he's endearing, because he's not a hero, he's an anti-hero, yet at the same time, he's not a terrible dickbag either. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that, so apparently the story, to sum it up, at least, and this is from a couple different outlets too, so this wasn't just one, is that apparently a Taylor Swift joke that somehow, I don't even know how they would have even known, like, who told Taylor Swift? Did she know? Did they have to write to her and say, that this was what's going on? Or was this an FX decision where FX got wind of it after, like, when the scripts were turned in, and then they said, oh, that's too far, and that, like, the joke was too far? If that's really what canceled this show, or this cartoon rather, I'm very disappointed in FX, because you blew a golden opportunity. If there's one comic book character that you could make an adult mainstream cartoon that could compete on the level of the Arrowverse for against the CW, or the various other Netflix shows that are on Marvel, or that Marvel's running, for crying out loud, as well as, your Legions and Gifted that are also running on, the other networks. Gotham's another one too, by the way. Of all the things, not one of those shows is animated in the slightest, and Deadpool was the perfect character to break that mold in terms of having an adult-themed cartoon that you could market to the adults, not necessarily to the kids, but you could market to the adults, and maybe the kids would gravitate towards it like they do The Simpsons or Family Guy to a certain lesser extent, even though they're not supposed to. But, you let it go and you let it slip through your fingers, and I'm very disappointed, because the last time we had an opportunity like this, it was Spawn, and Spawn, we all know, I haven't seen the show, but I've read great reviews of it, the animated series. I've read great reviews of it, and it's definitely interesting. I'm all for, Spawn, by the way, the upcoming new movie and everything. I'm all up for that, because like I said, Spawn is one of those characters who does not get enough love, especially as an independent creation, free from the machine that was DC and Marvel. You talk about a lasting impact. 25 years later, people are still actually intrigued and interested in Spawn, and that, like I said earlier, a lot of that credit goes to Todd McFarlane for keeping the character fresh and interesting, and also just, knowing how to write and committing to writing him. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, Marvel once again drops the ball on a very golden opportunity. Like I said, you've got kids' cartoons about superheroes, and those are all fine and dandy. In fact, many of the best superhero media in terms of television shows have been those cartoons. But to think that Deadpool was, because of a joke about a celebrity, not going to either sell, or was just, like they were going to upset and offend someone, it's just, ugh. It's just, ugh. Thanks a lot, Taylor Swift. I never was getting back together with you, even if I wanted to, even if I was 22 and you were too. But sorry for the grown-worthy Taylor Swift references, because, yeah, even though I don't like her, yeah, I do know her song titles, and I have heard her songs, because, well, she is a pop diva after all. Anyways, this has been episode 79 of Comics Corner. I hope you guys all enjoyed. I'm going to try not to go on a nearly 3-week break rather, in between episodes. But if that doesn't happen, then, or if it does happen rather, it happens. But thank you all for listening and watching this on YouTube, and I hope to see you guys all again next time. Be sure to share this video with all of your friends, and if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe and like and share the video and all that other, generic YouTube stuff. I am Jason, the curator of comics, signing off.